Back in high school and college, I liked to go hiking in nearby parks. I wouldn't consider myself a serious hiker, and I didn't camp overnight, but I just liked getting out into nature and clearing my head. Most of the time I never saw anyone else on the trails, which was honestly how I liked it. However, one experience and one person was completely terrifying. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when I decided to check out a new trail in a park about an hour from my house. This place was known for its thick forests and winding paths, nothing too remote, just a local spot where people went to escape the daily grind. I packed some water, a few snacks, and my phone, then hit the road. When I got there, the parking lot only had a couple of cars, which was perfect. I laced up my boots, took a deep breath of that crisp forest air, and started down the trail. The first half hour was pure bliss. Tall trees towered overhead, their leaves rustling in the breeze, and birds chirped in the distance. The trail twisted through the woods, and I could hear the faint trickle of a stream nearby. It was exactly what I needed, a break from everything. But then, as I rounded a bend, I saw someone coming from the opposite direction. He was a guy, maybe in his 40s, wearing a faded jacket and carrying a backpack with hiking poles clipped onto it. He smiled as he approached and gave me a friendly wave. "Hi there, beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" he said, his voice cheerful. "Yeah, it really is," I replied, keeping it polite. "You hiking alone?" he asked. His eyes locked onto mine for a second too long. "Yep, just enjoying the quiet," I said, hoping he'd take the hint that I wasn't looking for a chat. "Me too," he said, "though it's always nice to have company out here, just in case." I nodded awkwardly. Then he introduced himself as Dave and asked if I came to this park often. I told him it was my first time on this trail. "Oh, you'll love it," he said. "There's some great views up ahead." We talked for about another minute, but I started to feel uneasy. He kept asking questions, like where I was from, if I lived nearby, and how often I hiked alone. His tone was friendly, but it felt like he was digging for something. I kept trying to give him hints, giving short, vague answers, and then finally said, "Well, I should get going. Enjoy your hike." "You too," he said, flashing that same smile, and I continued on my way. After he left, the encounter started to slip from my mind. It was weird, but people run into each other on trails all the time, right? However, another 20 minutes later, as I stopped to take a picture of a small waterfall, I glanced up and saw him again. He was just sitting on a rock off the path, maybe 30 feet away, watching me. Then he waved when he saw me look over. "Hey, fancy meeting you here," he called out. My stomach tightened. "How'd you get ahead of me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, I took a shortcut through the woods," he said casually. "I know this park like the back of my hand." Somehow that didn't sit right with me. The trail was pretty straightforward, and I hadn't seen any obvious shortcuts. But I still did my best to force a smile and say, "Cool," before moving on. I told myself he was just a quirky hiker who liked talking to people, no big deal. Only it didn't stop there. Another 15 minutes down the trail, I took a fork to the left, hoping to explore a quieter section. I was starting to relax again, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots, when I saw him again. This time he was standing next to a tree, right where the path curved, staring back at me. Now I was freaked out. I decided to confront him and asked, "Are you following me?" He chuckled. No, just a coincidence. These trails loop around a lot." I honestly didn't buy it. The park wasn't that small, and this was the third time I'd seen him in less than an hour. "I'm actually gonna head back," I said, turning around. "Have a good one." "Take care," he replied, but there was something off about his tone, like he wasn't happy I was leaving. I decided to pick up the pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The forest, which had felt so peaceful before, now seemed depressive. The trees blocked out more sunlight as I went, and every rustle in the bushes made my heart jump. I didn't see him behind me, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, just out of sight. When I finally got close to the trailhead, I thought I was in the clear. The parking lot was just ahead through a gap in the trees, but as I stepped out of the woods, I saw him again. He was leaning against the signpost near the lot, like he'd been waiting for me. My blood ran cold. How in the world had he gotten there so fast? I kept my head down, pretending not to notice him, and made a beeline for my car. I was fumbling with my keys when he called out, "Hey, wait up!" I turned reluctantly. He was walking towards me, holding something in his hand. "I think you dropped this," he said, offering me my water bottle. I checked my backpack, and sure enough, it was gone. "Oh, thanks," I said, reaching for it. But as I took it, a chill ran down my spine. It was a plain, generic bottle, no markings and no label. How did he know it was mine? I didn't stick around to ask. I muttered a quick thanks and jumped into my car, locking the doors the second I was inside. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I looked in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, watching me go, that same creepy smile on his face. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a weird guy who liked hiking too much. But a week later, I went to a different park, hoping to put it behind me. Like before, I was in the parking lot tying my boots, but then I saw a figure walking towards me from across the lot. It was Dave. My heart stopped. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, grinning. "I figured you'd be here. You said you liked hiking in different parks, right?" To the best of my knowledge, I never told him that. "Look, I don't know what your deal is, but leave me alone," I said, stepping back towards my car. His smile vanished. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, his voice low. "Just hiking, same as you." But the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't, told me this wasn't normal. I didn't care. I didn't wait for him to say more. I got in my car and drove off, hands trembling on the wheel. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house made me jump, imagining him out there, watching through the windows. The next day I called the park rangers and the police, explaining everything. They took my report, but since he hadn't technically broken any laws, they couldn't do much. They just told me to be careful and maybe stop hiking alone for a while. Ultimately, I took their advice. After that, I only went hiking with friends or in big groups. Thankfully, I never saw Dave again, but the damage was done. Every time I'd step onto a trail, I'd scan the trees, half expecting to see him lurking there, waiting. Even now, years later, I can't quite shake that uneasy feeling. I still wonder what he wanted, and what might have happened if I hadn't gotten away when I did. It's a reminder that nature can be beautiful, but it's not always safe, and sometimes, the scariest things out there look just like everyone else. I started dating my future wife Stephanie in college, and one of our favorite activities was hiking and backpacking. There were a couple really nice parks, including state parks near campus, and when the weather was nice, we'd go almost every weekend. Essentially, every single one of our experiences was great, but there was one time things turned out very differently. It was late spring, the air warm and thick with the scent of blooming wildflowers. Stephanie and I decided to try a longer overnight trip, camping deep in one of the state parks we loved. Up to this point, we'd done plenty of day hikes, but this was our first time packing tents and sleeping bags, excited for a night under the stars. The forecast was clear, and we set off with high spirits, following a trail that wound through dense forest and up a series of low ridges. The hike in was peaceful. Birds chirped overhead, and sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the path. We reached our planned campsite by late afternoon, a small clearing near a trickling creek surrounded by towering pines. Then we set up our tent, cooked a simple meal over a portable stove, and settled in as dusk fell. The woods grew quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl, and it felt like the perfect getaway, honestly. However, as night deepened, something changed. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound, a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone striking a tree with a stick. It was very faint, coming from somewhere beyond the creek, I thought. I lay still, listening, assuming it was just an animal or the wind. Then Stephanie stirred beside me, whispering, "Do you hear that?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice low. "Probably nothing. Let's go back to sleep." Eventually the tapping stopped after a few minutes, and I convinced myself it was no big deal. But just as I started to drift off, it returned, louder this time, closer. It seemed to be a deliberate pattern, and my heart kicked up a notch. I unzipped the tent flap slightly and peered out, but the darkness was impenetrable beyond the faint glow of our dying campfire. "Maybe it's another camper," Stephanie suggested, though her voice trembled. "There's no one else out here," I replied. We'd seen no other cars at the trailhead, no signs of anyone on the path. Also, this part of the park was remote and rarely visited. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, just shadows and branches. The tapping stopped again, and we sat in silence, straining to hear. Then we heard a new sound, footsteps, heavy and uneven, crunching through the underbrush. They were moving in a wide arc around our campsite, circling us. I flicked off the flashlight, not wanting to give away our exact position. Stephanie gripped my arm, her breathing shallow. "Who's out there?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. Stay quiet." The footsteps paused, and for a moment the silence was deafening. Then a voice, a raspy, guttural mutter, carried through the night. Lost, all lost. It was too far to make out clearly, but close enough to send a chill down my spine. Whoever, or whatever it wasn't friendly. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, 1:47 a.m. No signal, of course. We were miles from civilization. The muttering continued, disjointed and eerie, like someone talking to themselves. Not supposed to be here. No, no, no. Then the footsteps resumed, drawing nearer, now on the opposite side of the creek, maybe 30 yards away. "We need to get out of here," Stephanie hissed, already stuffing her sleeping bag into her pack. "We can't," I whispered back. "It's pitch black. We'll get lost or run right into whoever that is." "Then what do we do?" I honestly didn't have an answer. My flashlight was our only weapon, and the tent felt like a flimsy shield. The footsteps stopped again, and the muttering grew louder and more agitated. "See you. I see you." My blood ran cold. Could he actually see us? The tent was dark, but maybe he'd spotted the embers of our fire or heard us whispering. I motioned for Stephanie to stay still and peeked out the flap again. This time, my flashlight caught something, a glint of reflection, like eyes, low to the ground among the trees. But it vanished as soon as the beam hit it. The muttering stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of something crashing through the brush, moving away fast. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe we'd scared him off. But then, a new noise, a sharp metallic clank, like a tool hitting rock, echoed from the direction he'd gone. It repeated, steady and purposeful, growing fainter as if he was retreating deeper into the woods. Needless to say, we didn't sleep after that. Instead, we sat huddled in the tent, jumping at every sound and waiting for dawn. When the first light finally broke through the trees, we packed up in record time, desperate to leave. As we broke down the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a single muddy footprint, barefoot, human-sized, pressed into the dirt just outside the tent flap. I also knew for a fact it hadn't been there when we set up camp. We hiked out as fast as we could, glancing over our shoulders the whole way. The trail felt longer than it had the day before, and every shadow a threat. When we reached the parking lot, our car was the only one there, just as it had been when we arrived. But scratched into the driver's side door was a single word: leave. We reported the whole experience to the park rangers, but they brushed it off. Probably vandals, they said, or some hermit living off the grid. They apparently found no trace of anyone when they checked the area later. But Stephanie and I knew what we'd heard, and what we'd felt. Someone had been out there with us that night, watching and waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that if we left that tent, we might not have made it back. We never went camping again, and even day hikes started to lose their appeal after that. The woods we once loved now hold a shadow we can't unsee, a reminder that some places, and some people, don't want to be found. I was in an honor society in college, mostly because I thought it would look good on a resume and be good for networking. Throughout the year, we had to attend various service events, like helping out a charity, cleaning up a park, volunteering at a shelter, that kind of thing. For the most part, I really liked it, though there was another freshman named Mandy who always got on my nerves. She was honestly pretty attractive, but she was also rather outspoken and blunt, and I inadvertently got into an argument with her one time. Whenever we went to events together, I tried to stay as far away from her as I could. One day, we were volunteering to help fix the trails in a large park, and like always, I was hoping I wouldn't get paired up or put in a group with Mandy. This park was vast, with sprawling woods and rugged trails that wound through valleys and up steep hills. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of moss and wet leaves, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in soft, dappled patterns. It was beautiful, but there was an edge to it, a quiet that felt almost too heavy, like the woods were watching us somehow. We gathered near the ranger station as the event organizer started assigning teams. I stood at the back, trying to blend into the crowd, but when the assignments were announced, my stomach sank. "Mandy and you're on Trail C," the organizer said, barely looking up from her clipboard. Mandy glanced at me, her hazel eyes narrowing slightly, and I could tell she wasn't thrilled either. "Fantastic," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for me to hear though. I clenched my jaw and grabbed the shovel from the pile of tools, determined to just get through the day. Trail C turned out to be one of the more remote sections of the park, a narrow path that snaked along a ridge overlooking a deep ravine. Mandy and I walked in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She carried a rake over her shoulder, her posture relaxed, but her expression tight. I did my best to keep my distance, focusing on the trail ahead. As we started working, clearing fallen branches and leveling out eroded sections, I couldn't help but notice how efficient she was. Her movements were precise, almost methodical, and she didn't hesitate to tackle the tougher spots. Still, I kept my comments to myself. The less we talked, the better. After about an hour, Mandy paused, wiping sweat from her brow. "You know," she said, her tone sharp, "if you're going to sulk the whole time, this is going to be miserable for both of us." "I'm not sulking," I shot back, more defensive than I meant to sound. "I'm just trying to get this done." She rolled her eyes. "Sure, you've been avoiding me like the plague since that stupid argument. It's honestly exhausting." "Well, maybe if you weren't so quick to argue, we wouldn't have this problem," I said, digging my shovel into the dirt harder than necessary. Mandy crossed her arms, her voice rising. "Maybe if you weren't so uptight, you'd realize I'm not the enemy here." We glared at each other, the tension crackling like static. For a moment, I thought we'd end up shouting right there on the trail, but then something shifted. Mandy sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Look, can we just try to get through this? I don't want to fight." I hesitated, surprised by the softness in her tone. "Fine," I said finally, "let's just work." We continued in silence, but the air felt different, like the sharp edges between us had dulled just a little. As we moved deeper into the woods, the trail grew narrower, the trees closing in around us. The sunlight dimmed, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, pulling in the hollows of the forest floor. Then Mandy stopped suddenly, tilting her head. "Do you hear that?" I paused, listening. At first, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves. But then I caught it, a low, rhythmic tapping, like wood against wood, coming from somewhere off the trail. "What is that?" I whispered, my skin prickling. Mandy frowned, peering into the trees. "I don't know, it sounds deliberate." Against my better judgment, I found myself following her as she stepped off the trail, pushing through the underbrush. The tapping steadily grew louder and sharper, and as we rounded a cluster of pines, we saw it. An old wooden signpost, half buried in the dirt, swaying slightly in the breeze. The tapping came from a loose plank banging against the post. "That's weird," Mandy said, stepping closer. "This isn't on the map." I glanced at the sign, squinting to read the faded letters. "Restricted area, do not enter." Below it, someone had scratched a crude symbol into the wood, a circle with lines radiating outward, like a sunburst. "Restricted," I muttered to myself. "For what?" Mandy traced the symbol with her finger, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's an old ranger outpost, or something else." I snorted. "You're always looking for a mystery, aren't you?" She smirked, glancing at me. "And you're always pretending you're not curious." I opened my mouth to argue, but then I noticed something, a faint trail leading away from the sign, barely visible through the undergrowth. It was overgrown, but the path was there, winding deeper into the woods. "We should check it out," Mandy said, her eyes lighting up. "No way," I said. "We're already behind on the trail, and that sign says restricted." "Oh, come on," she teased, her tone lighter than before. "Where's your sense of adventure?" Something about the way she said it, half challenging but half playful, made me pause. Maybe it was the way her smile softened her sharp features, or the fact that she seemed genuinely excited. Against my better judgment, I sighed. "Fine, but if we get in trouble, it's on you." "Deal," she said, grinning. We followed the faint trail, the woods growing denser with every step. The air also felt cooler, and the shadows thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trail twisted and turned, leading us farther from the main path, and soon I realized I had no idea where we were. "Wait," I said, stopping. "Do you remember the way back?" Mandy glanced around, her confidence faltering. I think so." But as we tried to retrace our steps, the trail seemed to shift. Landmarks we'd passed, a gnarled tree, a moss-covered rock, were gone. The woods felt different, more oppressive, and my heart started pounding. "We're lost," I said, my voice tight. "No, we're not," Mandy insisted, but her tone was uncertain. "We just need to keep going." But the more we walked, the more disoriented we became. The trees all looked the same, and the light was fading as the sun dipped lower. Panic clawed at my chest. "This isn't right. We should have hit the main trail by now." Mandy stopped, her face pale. "Okay, maybe we are lost." "Great," I snapped. "This was your brilliant idea." She flinched, and I immediately regretted my tone. "Sorry," I muttered. "I'm just scared." "Me too," she admitted, her voice small. We stood there, surrounded by the silent woods, and for the first time I saw vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't the brash, annoying girl I thought she was. She was scared, just like me. Without thinking, I reached out and took her hand. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. "Together." She squeezed my hand, and something shifted between us. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was trust, and maybe even something more. As if in response to our newfound resolve, we heard a distant shout. "Hey, anyone out there?" It was one of the other volunteers. Relief flooded through me. "Over here," I yelled back. We followed the voice, stumbling through the underbrush until we broke through to the main trail. The rest of our group was there, looking worried. "Where the hell have you two been?" one of them asked. "Got turned around," I said, avoiding Mandy's gaze. "Won't happen again." They didn't press us, and we finished the day's work without incident. But as we packed up to leave, Mandy pulled me aside. "Thanks for, not freaking out back there." I smiled. "You too. Maybe you're not so bad after all." She laughed, a real laugh, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Maybe you're not either. From that day on, things were different. We started talking to each other at events and sharing stories, and discovered we had more in common than I thought. She wasn't just blunt, she was passionate, honest, and fiercely loyal. And eventually I found myself looking forward to seeing her, even seeking her out. Months passed, and our friendship deepened into something neither of us expected. One evening, as we were hiking a familiar trail, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink, I stopped and turned to her. "Mandy, But she was already looking at me, her eyes soft. "I know," she whispered, stepping closer. Our first kiss was under those trees, with the scent of pine and the sound of the wind wrapping around us. It felt like the woods themselves had brought us together, like that strange, scary moment in the forest had been the start of something beautiful. Years later, when we got married, we chose a park for our wedding, a different one of course, but still surrounded by nature. As we exchanged vows, I glanced at the trees swaying gently in the breeze and smiled. We'd come a long way from that restricted trail and the eerie signpost, but in a way, I was grateful for it. It had led me to her. And as we walked hand in hand down the aisle, I knew that no matter where life took us, we'd always find our way, together.